Hello, and welcome to my commentary on your second Google Hangout on air that your group, Randi, Todd, Kenneth, and Stefanie recorded a couple weeks ago. I wanted to tell you that it was a very well facilitated and very well led discussion, and I appreciated your participation and your coverage and comprehensive discussion on the topics that were outlined in that section. So I'm going to start by your discussion on the first question about the dependencies or relationship between the policymaker and the intelligence analyst. And Kenneth sort of led that discussion on that topic and outlined that the intelligence analyst is the one that, or other ones that conduct a fact-based research and are not supposed to make the assumptions and not to display a personal bias. However, they sort of fulfill the expectations of the policymakers who set the agendas. And I think this is a really critical part that speaks to the first section of the intelligence cycle, which is the requirements or setting the requirements. Certainly, this is the inherent issue in the intelligence cycle, that it is a policymaker that sets the requirements. So the intelligence analysts will be conducting collection and exploitation and the analysis on issues of interest to the policymaker. So in that, certainly the agenda of the policymaker does drive the intelligence process and not the other way around, where, you know, we can argue that perhaps it's too skewed. And perhaps it's also useful to think about that intelligence cycle ending in a feedback. And as you know, Loventhal mentions that feedback is often the last and the least appreciated section of that intelligence cycle, because when you think about feedback, particularly in homeland security intelligence, it should be the ultimate consumers of that intelligence product that are going to voice their priorities for intelligence collection. But certainly it is unfortunate or fortunate that policymakers have very short tenures compared to the intelligence community professionals. And so they changed and the agendas change, and the requirements are going to be that first step in the intelligence cycle, and that feedback very often is ignored. So perhaps this is where a sort of a disconnect also happens. But certainly, the decision maker sets what they want research and what they want the intelligence product to be on. And obviously, the intelligence analyst is going to provide the intelligence product based on requirements. And as you saw in the weapons of mass destruction requirement, it is the way that the policymaker frames the importance or priority of the issue that often is going to infuse that collection and the analysis already with predetermined bias. And that certainly has been the case when you're talking about intelligence failures and weapon of mass destruction. It's not necessarily the issue with the intelligence community as much as it is the issue with requirements. What kind of questions were asked of the intelligence community to focus on? So, you know, that goes sort of with Randi claim that the policymakers set or choose objectives that support their agenda. And so that objectivity already is sort of compromised from the start. And of course, the intelligence, you know, how the policymaker is going to act upon the intelligence provided, it's also going to be driven by you know, possibly the constraints or threat that the intelligence received might not support what they want to hear, or might indicate some flaws in their decision-making process to date. So the relationship is very strenuous because it is grounded in that Sherman-Kent idea that the intelligence analyst does not influence the policy. The intelligence analyst is at the service of the policymaker. And so in a lot of ways, when you're thinking about larger strategic mission of a policymaker within the national security and homeland security realm, it's he or she that set those priorities, while the intelligence community might be closer to the sources of, particular priority. That's, not the way that, dotted line works. And so, I think, Kenneth, you mentioned about the CIA and Department of Defense issues in Benghazi, and that the intelligence was supplied on security protocols, on vulnerabilities in diplomatic security in Libya, and yet at a time it was not in line with perhaps the policymaker agenda. And if you think back to that political environment, that was at a time where, there was a strong push for, acknowledging that the Al-Qaeda as a large terrorist network has been substantively weakened. So it was not perhaps in the priority of a decision maker to sort of, focusing on those issues, even though the intelligence was there. So it's this inherent thing about taking action that, intelligence analysts can only do that much to, providing the finished intelligence product. But because they cannot, we are not supposed to influence the policymaker or have them make certain decisions. It's certainly a policymaker responsibility or ethical, moral duty to act on them. A lot of times, for a variety of different reasons, those priorities are not heeded. I think you had a really good discussion, Ken, and the rest of the group on relationships and the fact that, again, it is a relationship of the service provided to a consumer or a customer, here also known as the decision maker, and so it is, in a way, a very economical relationship. I think you used the term economical. I thought it was very interesting, and that it has to be volitional, which you brought it from the reading. So it's about trust building and about the relationships and about how a particular policymaker, what their background is in intelligence versus business agenda. I think you mentioned the James Baker example on the issues that what the intelligence community might want to prioritize might not be necessarily what at the given time the international relations or foreign affairs or some other priorities are for that particular administration. Certainly Stefanie mentioned that policymakers are very selective in what they want to hear and what they want to buy, so to speak, out of that market place, out of that product that the intelligence community provides. I think Kenneth had a big discussion on collection. I think we need to differentiate the process of collection and a process of analysis, because in a pure intelligence cycle process, different people collect, different people exploit, and different people analyze. And that is done to avoid the bleeding of the bias. from the collector, who has obviously the most at stake, that works with the assets, that works with the human, that, is setting priorities where and how to collect, and then to the next step where it gets sorted out, and then to the next step where it gets analyzed. So let's not equivocate the collector with the analyst, because they are a little bit separate in that intelligence cycle, or at least there should be separate processes. And perhaps the issue is that sometimes we sort of, compound the entire process into one step. And of course, as far as collection and the policymaker has to make budget decisions, and they are accountable for how resources are being allocated. So the intelligence community has its own agenda, so to speak, particularly because they are long-term professionals versus policymakers that are short-term. At the most, if they're lucky, they're re-elected, and they serve 2 terms, but that's pretty much the term limit, for example, for a president. So intelligence professionals are going to have a lot longer exposure in a field. Now, that exposure also runs a risk. Even though they are subject matter experts, they might get into that sunken bias as well, because the issue that has been predominant for them for a very long time, they tend to focus on as well. They might not see the shifting priorities and the changing landscape that's at a more strategic level of policy making. And, Stefanie, you point out some really interesting points about policymakers are not coming typically from the intelligence community. So a lot of that volitional stuff that Ken was talking about is going to be driven by personalities a lot of times as well. And we certainly have seen that historically, in the intelligence community. The personalities and the leadership roles do make an impact on how that relationship between policymaker and the intelligence analyst progresses, and how much actionable that intelligence might be. If there's erosion of trust or low credibility, or some issues that the policymaker has with the intelligence community, that's going to affect that relationship. And certainly the creation of a director of national intelligence was supposed to alleviate some of those, to the point where there was a lot more representation of different entities from the intelligence community versus just historically the CIA and the director of CIA, that sometimes was in good graces of the president and sometimes wasn't in good graces of the president. So that personality conflict of just a person that represented a very, very large component of intelligence analysis, that was not a good relationship. That was very detrimental to the intelligence community process. And certainly the reform was supposed to alleviate those issues. I think Todd mentioned, when you're talking about the intelligence failures very often are blamed on intelligence analysts, and this is where those professionals and subject matter experts get so demoralized and feel unheeded. And Todd, you mentioned the Katrina, and certainly Katrina was. When you're looking at the intelligence cycle and intelligence community, Katrina is being a domestic crisis management, domestic incident management falls within that Homeland Security enterprise, right? And domestic information processing and information management that should follow a very similar path as the intelligence process, right? We had those discussions, what's different in the intelligence cycle when you are talking about national security versus homeland security. But I like the way you brought homeland security into that, because this is a growing area in our intelligence community. And you talked about information was provided, the predictions, the modeling, the Hurricane Pam exercises that clearly indicated that New Orleans levees were structurally unsound, that the worst case scenario was simulated and projected. And then Mayor Nagin did not act or acted on that information or corroborated information, or open source intelligence, if you want to call it that way, really late. And so, Ken, I think you sort of talked about, so you have a late dissemination here. And that's certainly an issue more so with the full intelligence process as far as national security agenda. Obviously the intelligence cycle takes time. And before you get that, policymakers want something quick. They want something actionable. They want to be 100% certain. And that process sometimes is very long. In case of domestic issues, certainly the intelligence process cannot be that long. And again, I think that when you're looking at the steps of the cycle, Todd diagnosed it correctly, that it was a process of dissemination of the proper intelligence or information reaching the right people at the right time. And so again, I think a really good discussion here on bringing the intelligence cycle conversation to also matters that are not necessarily threats from the external hostile elements, but also in our hazard environment. The processes should be very similar, and not heeding or not acting. It's an issue of leadership as well, or building trusting relationships. Then the question was about declassification and the role of the policymaker as the ultimate decision maker in whether to declassify certain intelligence aspects. And I thought that it was very interesting that most of you agreed that Loventhal makes that claim that policymakers want to have the process more transparent, and they want to argue their policy making. They want people to have a larger awareness how they make those decisions, right? Whereas the intelligence community is really safeguarding those sources and methods. And here is that friction between policymaker and the intelligence community. And you all agreed that for the sake of national security, declassification is not really recommended because policymakers do not have a very big intelligence background acumen. They need to rely on the intelligence community to sort of dictate where they should go with it. But that's not how the process works, because again, we're going back to the policymaker setting the agenda. And with declassification, sources and methods, think about that. I don't think you discussed that in big depth. A lot of times in the intelligence studies, we learn that the processes in the intelligence cycles were flawed, but you will not know what processes are flawed if everything is classified, because then the research is not very possible, because so much stuff is not accessible to inquiry, and because it's shrouded in secrecy. And I think that it's really important to keep in mind that a lot of intelligence is overclassified. And classification system is very cumbersome and very costly. And it also creates those stovepipes among the agencies because they have different classification standards. So we have to be cognizant of that constraint that the public is very leery, even though you say that Stefanie was saying that the public doesn't need half of that knowledge. And they can't make educated opinions about that if it's released. But yet, in the era of more increased open source intelligence and access, and everybody being their own analyst, people do actually have a very big hunger for transparency of those processes. So I think that there is a balance. Obviously, fortunately or unfortunately, the policymaker hopefully will listen to the subject matter experts and to professionals in the intelligence community. But ultimately, they do have that authority to declassify and make the process is more transparent if they choose to do so, as long as they choose it for the right reasons, obviously. And the interesting case is, with the classification issues are also very dependent on the current threat landscape or threat and hazard landscape. So case in point, some of the materials from the Cold War with sources and methods. Once the Cold War was over, there was a lot of discussion on declassifying a lot of that material, but then, the political landscape changed. And because of the current international relations, foreign affairs, and our stance with Russia, for example, those decisions have been pulled back or scaled down. So I think that declassification of sources and methods is very dependent on the current political climate as well. So it has a lot to do with the political environment. Obviously, there is, with the classification decisions, I think you had the good discussion here on the public might not be the best consumer of this declassified stuff, but yet the counterintelligence elements, and you're studying counterintelligence this week, are all very expert of using this for, for tracking or for their own agendas as well. So there is this very delicate balance. But keep in mind, I don't think you raised that issue in your group, that we do experience a very heavy and very costly classification burden. And a lot of times, today with 24-hour news cycle leaks, particular leaks, there is this threat of intelligence coming out anyway. And so you have this real paradox of some professionals that cannot really function because they cannot rely on leaks, because they're still bound by the classification system, because that stuff that gets leaked doesn't always get declassified, right? So if you are an agent for a federal agency, or you are an intelligence analyst, you might not even be able to use what other people are using already. And also, when I talk about some stuff being overclassified, I talk from personal experience. And, a lot of times the classification of information is not really well substantiated. So sources and methods are very widely known. They're very widely used by other actors in other nation states and other countries. And, there is a lot of constraint on, because of, need to know, sometimes there is no reason to classify it a certain way, because you can, pretty much Google it, a lot of that information that otherwise you have to go through classification channels in your agency. So that is a paradox that I have seen in my line of work, where, you had to obey all those different protocols at the same time. Somebody that was not even within an agency had access to much better information sources that were out on the open market. The other question was about how did the and whether the intelligence reforms of 2004, post-2004, removed the stovepipes. And Todd, I really liked the way Todd delineated actually the things that happened post the intelligence reform. So what did the intelligence reform do? And Randi, I think you were talking about, it's really hard to track that restructuring if you're not very well versed in all those acronyms and the Treverton and Loventhal use. But Todd did a really good assessment and talked about the fact that the Director of National Intelligence sort of took away this very, very strong focus on one agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the Central Intelligence Agency Director being sort of a overall whisperer to the policymaker in matters of intelligence, while we suddenly found ourselves post 9/11 in an environment that it was no longer just national security, but that internal security, homeland security issues that were becoming so prevalent to us. So we looked at other models of other countries, and we had those discussions about creating a domestic intelligence agency, and we sort of elected not to create one. And so the creation of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence was sort of a hybrid solution. It was sort of in between. We are not going to create a totally new agency, but we are going to sort of bring more players that are more grounded in that homeland security or internal security structure, so they become players as well, so they can be represented, so they have a say. So it's not all about the director of CIA. Obviously is going to be driven by the culture, organizational culture and requirements of that agency predominantly. And because, they will have a bias too. So the Director of National Intelligence was supposed to alleviate that. Whether it was creation of just another middleman, it's subject for discussion. But Todd did talk about deputies. So not only CIA now, but also and military, which is a holder of this largest chunk of intelligence community, but also FBI and DHS started getting invited to play. Well, of course, they had to be invited to play because suddenly FBI got tasked with being a domestic intelligence agency function, which it didn't have. It had foreign counterintelligence, but not the domestic intelligence. So very good discussion on how the DNI was supposed to be located under the executive and Office of the President, and that decision was abandoned, or that plan. And I think that you can make your own assessment of whether there was a good move. Looking particularly at the political climate today. But the creation of National Counterterrorism Center, Counterproliferation Center, Terrorist Threat Integration Center was an effort, as Todd discussed, to have a more unified approach. So if you're thinking about crisis management and critical incidents and domestic incident management, we talk about this unified command. So the DNI was sort of kind of like infusing that concept of unified command also into the intelligence community and doing it our own way and not sort of mimicking the system in England or in Israel, where they have their domestic intelligence agency that is separate. So the unified approach to conduct sort of joint or fuse intelligence efforts The other factor that the creation of the DNI brought about, excuse me, that's my dog, is the National Intelligence Centers that you discussed. I thought that was really brilliant that you brought that out, and the function of liaisons. Again, we have some of those concepts coming out from crisis management, domestic incident management, and the liaison as being that linking pin between all those different participants. So as you look at the 9/11 Commission report and the fact that there were those stovepipes, so now those national intelligence centers were supposed to alleviate that issue. And moving, to third-party responsibility, separating between Director of Central Intelligence and Director of National Intelligence was supposed to sort of give a little bit more weight to other INTs, and particularly to focus on Homeland Security intelligence. And obviously, FBI with creating of National Security Branch suddenly came to the fore as the domestic intelligence agency, which it did not have that function. So that has been achieved. So in a way, what the reform did, it prevented us from creating a separate domestic intelligence agency, and found different ways to sort of go around that. Stefanie, when we were talking about the effectiveness, or how to measure it, is it effective or not? I think that it's hard to say, or too early to say. But Kenneth, suggested that perhaps this liaison function has been the most productive outcome of those efforts. The sort of, creating that middleman. And perhaps, shift in focus from intelligence for all versus intelligence for very few. Randi had a interesting information on InfraGard and this private-public sector infrastructure, and you discussed classification processes, I guess, there. And Kenneth talked about Jack Ryan and the intelligence process, or the role of the intelligence and analyst. I thought that was an interesting digression. And no, we do not have. You don't do the guesses yet. You're gonna guess your deception on your questions or introductions during the last Google Hangout. So Randi was talking about the DNI again being an attempt to sort of share or decentralize the ownership of that intelligence by those traditional holders in the new era. I think the next point of a discussion that was really excellent in your group, and I really enjoyed it, was on Trilogy and virtual case file. And I have lived it. So, I have a really good experience in that, because when I was working for the agency, we were all so anxious to switch and transition to virtual case file. And when we talk about intelligence and information, we cannot dismiss the progressing technologies. And certainly we would think that those federal agencies, particularly now FBI being, a sort of holder of a responsibility for domestic intelligence, that they would be properly equipped to do things faster with better resources. And, we do have those great ideas that they do have those resources, but certainly the FBI way of information sharing or processing cases was very archaic when the trilogy was considered. And specifically, I think that Todd talked about it. The virtual case file basically was an effort to remove paper stuff. To where you took files, and special files, particularly they were classified, you had to go to a certain place and read them and then close them and then go back, and then the way you shared particular leads with different offices were going through internal couriers, and it was a very, very expensive and cumbersome process, and also not very efficient as far as connecting the dots together, so to speak. So virtual case file was supposed to be that. It's supposed to be virtual, where you can pull out particular pieces and patch them or exchange information with people in different field offices working on similar angles or similar leads, and it would save time, and it would definitely be a little bit more analytical in a way, because when you have the data that is merged or can be exchanged faster, then of course your decision making is totally different than when you are pouring through tons and tons of old case files and papers and things like that. So now, we couldn't even use Google when I was working for the FBI, and you had intranet, and it wasn't as as user friendly either. So Todd talked about some of the issues. We were all trained on virtual case file. There was a lot of money that was spent. We as agents were never consulted on, really what is the, critical aspect of our job, what would be helpful, what suggestions, seasoned agents would recommend. So it was a very, very top driven approach. As you indicated, and rapid development approach that was no testing, lack of vetted prototypes, usability testing. That is where I come in. There sort of the end user was sort of not invited to contribute to the process, and that's very common in a lot of technology applications that we go for vendors or for different different markets, and contract consultants and people from external to the agencies that design a product for us. That's not just in federal government, but generally. And what happens is those external people do not have the sort of institutional knowledge that people within the organization might have who should drive that process. And that goes for emergency operation planning, continuity of operation planning, all different plans and processes, and different technologies that support those. So decision-making technologies sort of need the buy-in of the people that are end users. And you mentioned something that I think is really important. Todd brought that out from that article, that there wasn't enough middle-level management for IT that was skilled communicators. There were skilled evaluators. There would be skilled assessors of do needs assessments. And that's probably, a big part of an intelligence community that we often talk about the executive levels and the levels on the ground, and that middle is often ignored, and the middle is not strongly developed. So middle level management specifically. And that certainly was the case of the FBI. You have agents on the ground and, some supervisory layers, and then, you have field offices with special agents in charge and your DC, Pennsylvania Avenue substantive authorities, but not a whole lot of many layers in between, because that's the nature of bureaucracy. And so that mid-management, which is a really very important part in a private business, that would be also trained properly with, proper leadership skills, was a failure of that system as well. I think that, of course, organizational culture has a lot to do with that, and leadership. If you look at the and research some of the directors of the FBI over the years, you will see that the agency had, from the inception in 1908, when it was still called the Bureau of Investigations, it was Edgar Hoover that was fulfilling that role for a decade, and then for another 4 decades during FBI, Hoover was the director of the FBI. So you're looking at almost half a century of creating organizational culture by one personality. And then after that, there were only few FBI directors that had a longevity. So that certainly has not been a very progressive way with leadership in the FBI as well. And then, during Director Freer, and, more so during Mueller, who had the longest tenure, I think, after Webster, I think in the 70s, after Hoover. So Mueller sort of had more longevity, but it was kind of, touch and go over the years. So leadership is probably the new emerging topic in those in the intelligence community. And so I'm glad that you sort of teased it out. Legacy of knowledge. I think you had a discussion on that, and I think Stefanie started that, about old professionals and the new professionals coming in. I don't know how you started on that, but certainly a really critical part of intelligence community, as the baby boomers are being retired and the millennials are being inducted. There is a lot of institutional knowledge that sort of leaves. And so that goes back to what's called the succession planning and mentorship. And succession planning and mentorship programs within intelligence community organizations, I would say, is suffering from the same setback as leadership and ethics. Those are the topics that for many years were not part of, the overall training. So when you had your discussions perhaps on analytical transformation, I don't know how much emphasis that analytical transformation are actually put on developing leadership skills. So I thought that was really good. Succession planning is really huge for any organization, but certainly in those very, 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 very relevant or vital aspects of security and intelligence disciplines. And especially with changing technology so fast, it is a factor. Let's see. Recruiting and the sort of going back with the succession planning and mentorship, there is a tendency in organizations to do things the way we've always done them. And so with technology developing rapidly, is that type of thinking going to be conducive to have good qualified intelligence analysts that can have the strength or credibility or gravitas to influence policymakers? So I thought that was very interesting, that discussion that you had. Marketplace concept. I think that you talked about the stronger ascent. Open source intelligence probably is getting us into this arena of marketplace of ideas. I think we've got to be very careful with OSINT. As far as, you mentioned that a DNI was thinking about creating the Office of Open Source Information, Open Source Intelligence Agency. But that's sort of a discussion and more stress on OSINT. But what we need to keep in mind is also that not all information out there is OSINT. Open source is still subjected or should be subjected to the same rigorous intelligence cycle process. That means that it has to be coming from corroborated sources and vetted sources, reliable sources, has to be exploited from the noise, it has to be analyzed, it has to be mined, and it has to be put in models and analytical products that are corroborated. And so obviously, open source intelligence is really huge in policing, for example. Really critical to because it is faster, right? It's faster the way you access it, and you had a little conversation on overt versus covert, and I think the distinction between overt in French means open. And covert in French means closed or, not open. So overt means open source and covert means, using clandestine collection methods, mostly, secrecy. So the sources and methods and protection of sources and methods. So that's the difference. And so open source intelligence, again, not all information is intelligence. And just because we have access to a lot more data doesn't mean we are very good at utilizing OSINT, in the intelligence community. So I think that, however, it is, because it is faster and less expensive, right? It certainly is a direction forward in the intelligence community. But that sort of ties into the discussion on deception and disinformation and a very huge vulnerability of OSINT to be penetrated by counterintelligence services. So you are talking about counterintelligence this week, and certainly those are inherent threats to that end. As a collection discipline. And that ties in back to the 24/7 news cycle. And do we consider, the information intelligence just because it is, being put out there? And Randi, I think, had the put some weight on the differentiating between analysis, evidence-based research versus opinion, substantiating, triangulating, corroborating different points of information to make it more coherent and more stable and to look more like int than just pieces of information. And you talked about news media having inherent biases, whether it be our networks here. You mentioned Al Jazeera and BBC as having a lot more internal coherence, so to speak, and perhaps less bias. But, with news media, reporters or journalists, again, just like policymakers, are not intelligence analysts. So, they don't follow the process. What they do is called framing. And you called it hook, or hooking into the most sensational or the most controversial or not the full picture parts of the story. And that's very true, as media is known for what's called a framing of a discourse, and they will frame it around the issue that is relevant to them and, to what they expect the viewers want to see or want to hear at any given moment. So that certainly most of those networks will have their biases. And so, you have to be cognizant that, 24/7 reporting doesn't have the luxury of going through the intelligence cycle, because they have to meet the deadlines. They put out information that hasn't been corroborated, that has very weak points of support, that most of the time is opinion-based. And the danger is that it once goes out and you discuss that, it's out there. With no corroboration, once it's out there, even if the retractions are being published, nobody really reads those. So retraction is not relevant, and there is little authenticity of corroboration. Now, I'm thinking about some of the cases recently where leaks from federal agencies fed newspaper articles, and then federal agencies use those newspaper articles as a way to corroborating their stories, which is a really devious way of leveraging media as a sort of vetting component for OSINT. So if you're thinking that, you need to corroborate and you have a leak and then the newspaper publishes on it, and then you're using a newspaper as a source to add to your corroboration of intelligence, then you start having real integrity problems with OSINT in the intelligence community. So certainly, and again, those inherent threats of social media being used for disinformation purposes, very, very high vulnerability of OSINT. But that certainly, if used properly and processed properly, it is of tremendous value, collection discipline. Your conversation then moved to whether Director of National Intelligence is success or failure. And you did discuss those personality issues and the fact that, one president's affinity for Central Intelligence Agency director could have, dictate, it's a very volatile environment. And so it wasn't a very strong backing sometimes of the intelligence community. And so, while Bush met daily with Clinton had a lack of access for the director of CIA. So certainly the implementation of the director of national intelligence might have alleviated those issues. But again, the personalities still come into play in leadership roles. Randi, you were talking about MI5 as a solution. We didn't go that route, right? Because when we created DNI, it was the way of avoiding creating a domestic intelligence agency. And so when we look at the MI5, we're sort of impressed with the way the British have constructed their domestic intelligence agency. But I think we've got to be very cautious when evaluating across the different countries, because obviously there is a different approach to surveillance. For example, in Great Britain. Great Britain is a very small country with very small, it's an island with, not as many inhabitants as we have, and so when we compare the effectiveness, we did not go that route. Whether it's better or not, I'll leave it for you to still ponder till the end of the semester. But some of the assessment in Loventhal of how MI5 did not prevent 7/7 2005 or had failures in intelligence, point to the fact that even though they did have their domestic intelligence agency, they are still experiencing a lot of issues as well with using actionable intelligence, for counterterrorism. Now, certainly, their history with terrorism is different, and you were right about that. They're over 100 years of dealing with the Irish issue of terrorism, to say the least. I think you're going to enjoy the clandestine diplomacy reading that's assigned this week, which is specifically about clandestine diplomacy within PIRA, provisional IRA. So you might find that interesting. But again, when you're making comparisons, international comparisons, I think it's really fascinating to look at what other countries have done and what they have. But then you have to situate it back into sort of constitutional reality of the United States. And for us, DNI was a little bit less intrusive. Now, whether FBI truly and Department of Homeland Security can handle domestic intelligence, it still remains to be seen. So I think that's that many notes I had on your group. It was a really well conducted discussion. I thank you for your contributions, and I'm looking forward to your next discussion that I have received. So I'm looking forward to viewing it next week and providing you with some comments on it. Thanks a lot.